Please buy me, I'll give you sons. That's what the lonely widow begged the giant cowboy at her auction. The dust was still in the air, the hammer still ringing, when the crowd laughed. And one man stepped forward with silver in his hand. He thought he was buying a chance to keep her safe. He didn't know she held something worth more than cattle, gold, or even a man's pride, a spring that could keep her alive, or make her enemies rich. But in a town where the law wears a crooked smile, and the railroad shadow falls long, across the prairie, a paper promise may be the only thing sharper than a six-gun. The cowboy's got broad shoulders, but can he carry the weight of her past and the fight that's coming? The church bell's about to ring, the smoke's about to rise, and the lines in the dust are about to be drawn. When the auction's over and the hands are played, will she end up a wife, a prisoner, or the woman who saves them all? Every story I share leads with love, for people, for healing, for the things we sometimes forget to say out loud. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Red Butte's dusty auction yard as Jonah. Cade leaned against the weathered fence post. His shoulders ached from 3 hard days pushing cattle down from the high country. The familiar sense of livestock, hay, and trail dust filled the air, mingling with the sharper smell of coal smoke from the nearby railroad dot around him. The yard buzzed with activity. Miners in patched clothes clustered near the board, comparing notes on claims. Cattlemen in worn dusters traded gossip about prices, while townswomen hurried, tasked with baskets of fresh bread and produce for the evening meal. Jonah's gaze drifted to where his small herd waited in the holding pen. Good animals, grass-fed and sturdy. They'd fetch a fair price when his turn came. His horse Dusty dozed in the stable nearby, earning a rest after the long drive. The auctioneer's voice cut through the general din. Special lot coming up, folks. Step up, step up. Something in the man's tone made Jonah straighten. The crowd shifted, parting like water around a stone, and he saw her. A woman stood alone before the auction block, her spine straight as a fence post despite the obvious wear on her calico dress. Trail dust coated her boots, speaking of miles walked. But it was her eyes that caught him, clear as mountain springs and just as deep, set in a face too young for such heavy cares. Widow Carolyn Hawley, the auctioneer announced, consulting his ledger. Debt indenture sale under territorial statute. Outstanding notes total $842, owed to various parties. Bidding starts at $900 to cover fees. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jonah's jaw tightened. He'd heard of these debt laws but never seen one used. They weren't right, turning people into property over money owed. The widow's gaze swept the crowd, passing over the smirking faces of several local men until it locked with his. Her voice rang out clear and steady. Please buy me. I'll give you sons. The yard went quiet as a church on Monday. Jonah felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. There was no begging in her tone, no desperate plea, just a simple offer, spoken with dignity. Dot in the corner. A well-dressed man with a watch chain catching the sun shifted forward. Judge Whitlock. Jonah recognized him from previous visits to town. The judge's thin smile didn't reach his eyes as he called out, 900. Jonah studied Carolyn Hale's face. Pride lived there, and determination, but also something else. A flash of fear quickly masked when Whitlock bid. Her hands were work-roughened, her bearing straight despite obvious exhaustion. This was no helpless woman seeking rescue, but a fighter backed into a corner. 950, Jonah heard himself say. The words came naturally as if he'd planned them all along. Whitlock's head snapped around. 1,000. 1,100. Jonah kept his voice level, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The judge's face darkened. 1,200. The crowd's heads swiveled between the two men like they were watching a tennis match. Carolyn remained still as stone, but Jonah caught the slight tremor in her clasped hands. 1,500. Jonah didn't hesitate. It would take most of what he'd get for his cattle, but something told him this was right. A long moment passed. Whitlock's jaw worked as he calculated. Finally, he gave a curt nod and stepped back. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a gunshot. To Mr. Cade for $1,500. Caroline's shoulders relaxed a fraction, though her expression remained carefully neutral. As the crowd began to disperse, she walked toward Jonah with measured steps. Up close, he could see the fine lines of strain around her eyes, the way exhaustion pulled at her features. "Mr. Cade?" She met his gaze squarely. "I thank you for your intervention. I assume you'll want to discuss terms." Jonah nodded slowly. "Reckon we should." But first, he glanced at the setting sun, noting how she swayed slightly where she stood. "When did you last eat, Mrs. Holly?" A flash of surprise crossed her face before she could hide it. "Yesterday morning. I walked in from my place on Cedar Creek. 20 miles. He kept his voice neutral, though something in his chest tightened. "The cafe's still open. We'll talk over supper." She started to protest, then stopped herself. "That's very kind, mister Cade, but I should tell you now. I meant what I said. About sons. I know a man needs heirs, and I'm young enough still to—" "Mrs. Holly." Jonah held up a hand, gentle but firm. "Food first. Terms later. Whatever comes after. You'll think clearer with a hot meal inside you." For a moment, he thought she might argue. Then the last of the tension left her shoulders, and she nodded. "Thank you. I would appreciate that." As they walked toward the cafe, Jonah noticed how the townsfolk watched them pass, whispering behind their hands. Judge Whitlock stood in the shadow of the land office, his expression unreadable. But Jonah kept his attention on the woman beside him, matching his long stride to her tired steps. He'd come to town planning only to sell some cattle. Now he'd spent his profits buying a stranger's debts, all on the strength of clear eyes and a straight spine. But watching Carolyn Holly walk beside him, head high despite her circumstances, Jonah couldn't find it in himself to regret it. Some things he reckoned were worth more than money. What those things might be, well, that was a matter for discussion. Over supper, Carolyn and Jonah stepped down from the weathered auction platform, the fresh signed papers crackling in her hands. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and a cool breeze stirred the dust at their feet. "I appreciate your intervention, Mr. Cade," Carolyn said, her voice measured and clear. She smoothed the documents with careful fingers. "I should explain that my husband, Thomas, passed last winter." "The taxes ... double," quote, she paused, drawing a steady breath. "They went unpaid while I tended him through his fever." Jonah studied her face, noting the quiet strength there. "Mrs. Holly, I'm offering you honest work to repay the debt. No need to sacrifice your dignity in the bargain. That's more than fair." Relief flickered briefly in her eyes before she squared. Her shoulders again taut as they crossed the yard. Judge Whitlock's shadow fell across their path. The older man's fingers drummed against his vest watch chain, his thin smile not reaching his eyes. "This business isn't finished," he muttered, "just loud enough for them to hear, not by half." Caroline's spine stiffened, but she kept walking, head high. Jonah positioned himself between her and the judge, his broad shoulders blocking Whitlock's view. They continued on without responding. The cattle auction moved quickly once they returned. Jonah's small herd brought a fair price. Good animals. Always did. He counted the banknotes carefully, tucking them into his leather wallet while Carolyn waited nearby, her back straight, despite her obvious fatigue. "We'll need supplies," Jonah said, gesturing toward the mercantile. The bell above the door chimed as they entered the dim interior, where shelves stretched from floor to ceiling stacked with life's necessities. Carolyn moved with purpose, selecting items with careful consideration. Flour, coffee beans, garden, seed for spring planting. Her choices spoke of practicality and long experience managing a household. Jonah added extra supplies: sugar, salt pork, ammunition, knowing the distance to his ranch would require provisions. Outside, they loaded the purchases into his wagon. The leather harness creaked as Jonah secured the team, checking each buckle with practiced hands. The sun had begun its descent behind the western peaks when they finally turned onto the trail leading out of town. They traveled in companionable silence for several miles, the wagon wheels cutting fresh tracks in the dusty road. Finally, Carolyn spoke, her voice quiet but clear above the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. "There's something you should know, Mr. Cade." She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. The reason Judge Whitlock wanted my land, it's not just about the acreage. Jonah waited, letting her continue at her own pace. My ranch controls the only reliable spring for 20 miles in any direction. Her hands twisted in her lap. Come August, when the creek beds run dry, that spring could mean life or death for any herd in their valley. Jonah's hands tightened on the reins as understanding dawned. His own cattle would need that water to survive the late summer drought. The judge's eager bidding suddenly made more sense. Why didn't you tell me this before? He asked, careful to keep accusation from his voice. Carolyn turned to face him, then her eyes direct. I needed to know if you were a decent man first. Mr. Cade, that spring is too important to trust to someone who'd use it for power, like the judge would. Paused. I had to see if you'd help me as a person, not just as someone controlling water rights. Jonah nodded slowly, respecting her caution. Reckon that's fair enough. As dusk approached, they made camp beneath a stand of cottonwoods. The leaves whispered overhead in the evening breeze while Jonah built a small fire. He'd insisted Carolyn take his bedroll, despite her protests that she could manage with a blanket. The flames cast dancing shadows across their small camp, as Carolyn finally gave in to exhaustion. Her breathing growing deep, and Jonah settled himself against a fallen log, rifle across his knees. He'd keep watch through the night, protecting both his investment and the woman who'd trusted him with her future. The moon rose over the eastern ridge, silvering the cottonwood. Leaves. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely song echoing across the valley. Jonah's thoughts turned to the spring hidden away in Caroline's land, and to the judge's threatening words. He had a feeling their troubles weren't over. Not by far, but for now the night was peaceful. Carolyn slept soundly, and Jonah kept his vigil, watching the stars wheel overhead. While crickets sang in the grass, dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Carolyn and Jonah broke camp. The cottonwood leaves rustled overhead while they load the wagon, working in companionable silence. Jonah noticed how Carolyn folded his bedroll with practiced efficiency. Her movements speaking of years managing a household. The trail stretched before them like a dusty ribbon, winding through stands of scrub pine and around rocky outcrops. The wagon wheels jolted over deep ruts carved by spring rains, forcing them to pick their way carefully. Jonah handled the reins with patience, guiding the team around the worst spots. Sorry for the slow going, he said, steadying the wagon through. A particularly rough patch. Trail's seen better days. Carolyn gripped the seat as they bounced through another rut. No need to apologize. Better careful than broken axle. By midday, the sun beat down, fierce and hot. When they came upon a shallow creek cutting through a small meadow, Jonah drew the horses to a halt. Reckon we could all use a rest. While Jonah tended to the wagon team, Carolyn approached Dusty, his trail-worn horse. She ran skilled hands down his legs, checking for heat or swelling. The horse nickered softly as she loosened his saddle, letting him cool properly. You've got a way with horses, Jonah observed, watching her work. Carolyn smiled slightly, her fingers combing through Dusty's mane. Had to learn. Thomas was gone freighting most months. She paused, leading the horse to water. The Ute showed me how to care for stock, how to find water when the creeks run low. They know every seep and spring in these hills. Jonah nodded, respect deepening in his eyes. Those are good friends to have. They are. Caroline's voice grew quiet. Taught me more than just finding water. Taught me about respect for the land, for family. She straightened, brushing dust from her skirts. Your horse is sound, just needs rest and grain. They continued their journey through the afternoon heat. The landscape grew more familiar to Jonah with each mile, the lightning-struck pine marking the corner of his grazing lease, the three-fingered rock formation rising against the sky. Finally, as evening approached, his ranch came into view. The small bunkhouse stood solid against the backdrop of hills, its log walls weathered silver gray. Though rough-hewn, the building showed signs of care. Straight corners, swept yard, smoke pipe properly capped. A barn rose behind it, its doors hanging true on their hinges. Jonah helped Carolyn down from the wagon. "It ain't much," he said, suddenly aware of how modest his holdings must seem. But Carolyn was already taking in the details with a practical eye. "It's well maintained," she observed. "That matters more than size." He showed her around the barn with its neat tool rack and swept floors, the corral where a few horses dozed in the evening light, the pasture stretching toward the hills. Carolyn walked beside him, asking intelligent questions about water sources and grazing patterns. At the far edge of his property, she stopped, kneeling to examine the grass. "The soil's drier here than at my place," she noted. "The spring makes that much difference." "That it does," Jonah agreed, "especially come late summer." Back at the bunkhouse, Jonah built up the cook stove while Carolyn unpacked their supplies. The familiar rhythm of preparing an evening meal filled the small space, the snap of kindling, the soft thud of coffee being measured, the hollow sound of beans being poured into the pot. Lamplight cast a warm glow as they sat down to supper. The beans were plain but hot, served with thick slices of sourdough bread. They ate in comfortable silence, the day's travel having left them both more tired than talkative. When the dishes were done, Jonah gestured toward the narrow bed in the corner. "Take the bunkhouse. I'll sleep in the hayloft until we get things." Proper settled, Caroline's hands stilled on the dish towel. "Mr. Cade," she said carefully, "I need to warn you. Judge Whitlock isn't one to give up easily. He's used to getting his way." Jonah's face hardened slightly. "Reckon I faced worse than a crooked official in my time." His voice was quiet but firm. "You don't need to worry about him here." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you." The words were simple but carried weight. Outside, crickets had begun their evening chorus. Carolyn gathered her shawl around her shoulders and moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the latch, looking back at Jonah. "Good night, Mr. Cade." "Good night, Mrs. Holly." The door closed behind her with a soft click. Jonah stood for a moment in the quiet bunkhouse, then extinguished the lamp. Through the window, he could see a light still burning behind the curtain Carolyn had. He turned toward the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The crickets sang on, their steady chirping a familiar lullaby in the gathering dark. The morning sun cast long shadows as Jonah and Carolyn rode toward her old ranch. Their horses. Hooves kicked up dust from the dry trail, passing acre after acre of golden grass that crackled in the late summer heat. Carolyn sat straight in her saddle, but Jonah noticed how her fingers tightened on the reins as her homestead came into view. The ranch house stood weathered, but proud against the cloudless sky, its cedar shingles gray with age. A few chickens, scratch in the yard, somehow surviving on their own. The spring gurgled nearby, its clear water a lifeline in the parched landscape. "Still flowing strong," Carolyn said softly, dismounting near the spring. She pulled the canteen from her saddle and knelt beside the water. "Even in the driest years, it never failed us." Jonah watched her fill the canteens, noting how the water ran crystal clear. "Your husband chose well when he settled here." "Thomas had a good eye for land," Carolyn agreed, replacing the cork stoppers. "I reckon that's why the judge wants it so badly." "I'll check the barn," Jonah said, swinging down from his horse. "Stay within sight." The barn doors creaked as he pushed them open. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the gaps in the planks. His keen eyes caught sight of something that made his jaw tighten. Fresh boot prints in the dirt floor, leading to and from the loft. Outside. Carolyn climbed the porch steps, each board familiar under her feet. The door wasn't locked, nothing worth stealing out here except the land itself. Inside, the air hung still and musty. Her rocking chair sat empty by the window, a half-finished piece of mending still draped over one arm. She moved quickly, gathering what mattered most. The family Bible came first, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of hands. Next, she pulled her mother's silver hair comb from its drawer, running her fingers over the delicate tines. 3 quilts followed, each one stitched with memories. Her wedding quilt, one from her mother, and the first she'd made herself. Jonah appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. We've had visitors. Fresh tracks in the barn. Carolyn nodded, wrapping her treasures in one of the quilts. The judge? Most likely. He's... Jonah stopped mid-sentence, his head turning toward the window. Mount up. We've got company. Through the wavy gloss, they could see 3 riders on the ridge, the judge's distinctive black coat visible even at a distance. His companions sat their horses with the lazy confidence of hired guns. They're just watching, Jonah said quietly, helping Carolyn secure her bundle to her saddle. Testing us, maybe. They rode out at an unhurried pace, though Jonah's right hand never strayed far from his Colt. Carolyn didn't look back at her home, but she sat tall, chin lifted against the wind that carried dust, and the promise of trouble. The sun was low when they finally reached Jonah's ranch. After settling the horses, they sat on the porch, watching the evening paint the hills in shades of purple and gold. Crickets began their nightly chorus as Jonah broke their thoughtful silence. Full silence. We need to secure your rights to that spring, he said, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. Make it legally binding before the judge finds another angle. Carolyn turned to face him, her expression troubled. I've studied every paper in that Bible box. The law's clear. Only widows and veterans can file water rights claims in this territory. She paused, smoothing her skirt. And if they marry, their joint claim is even stronger. The crickets filled the silence between them as the meaning of her words settled like evening dew. A marriage of convenience, Jonah said, slowly, testing the words. It would protect the spring, Carolyn replied, her voice steady despite the flush rising in her cheeks. Keep it from the railroad and their mining camps, save both our herds come August. Jonah stood, boots scuffing against the weathered porch. Boards. He braced his hands against the railing, looking out at his land, acres that would be worthless without water. But it wasn't just about the cattle anymore. Something else had taken root, something as vital as any spring. I won't press you for an answer tonight, Carolyn said softly, rising to go inside. But the judge won't wait forever. She left him there on the porch, the evening breeze carrying the scent of sage and the weight of decisions yet to be made. The lamp she lit in the bunkhouse cast a warm glow through the window, like a beacon in the gathering dusk. 2 days passed like water over stones, filled with ranch work and careful thoughts. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when Jonah found Carolyn at the water pump. Her sleeves rolled up as she filled the kitchen bucket. Been thinking, he said, his voice gentle in the fresh morning air. Might be wise to ride into town, see the territorial clerk. Make sure we understand all our options. Carolyn wiped her hands on her apron, considering. Reckon that's sensible? When do we leave? Hours time? Road'll be cooler if we start early. The journey to town stretched before them like a dusty ribbon, the summer heat already shimming above the trail. Their horses walked steady, hooves raising little puffs of dust with each step. Fields of sage and scattered pine gave them shade. Now and then Walmita larks called from fence posts along the way. After an hour of companionable silence, Carolyn glanced at Jonah. Tell me something of yourself, she said. Before you came to Colorado Territory, Jonah adjusted his hat, buying time to arrange his thoughts. Grew up in Missouri. Moved to Kansas after the war. Thought I'd try farming. He paused, and Carolyn noticed how his shoulders tensed slightly. Met a girl there. Sarah was her name. The trail wound around a bend, and their horses navigated it without guidance, well used to the path. What happened? Carolyn asked softly. Though something in his tone told her the answer wouldn't be happy. Typhoid came through in 72, Jonah said, his voice as dry as the trail dust. Sarah ... She didn't make it. We were to be married that spring. He cleared his throat. Packed up after that. Came west, never looked to marry again. Carolyn let the silence settle between them, respectful of his loss. I'm sorry, she said finally. Losing someone you love, it leaves an empty place. Jonah nodded, grateful she didn't press for more. The town appeared ahead, buildings rising from the plain like weather-beaten ships in a sea of grass. They tied their horses outside the territorial office, a narrow building wedged between the general store and the land office. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper. Maps lined the walls, their corners curling in the dry air. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles. Water rights, you say? He pulled a heavy book from beneath his desk. Let me see here. Pages rustled as he searched. Yes. The Homestead Act of 1862, with the widow and veteran clause of 74. He adjusted his spectacles. Says here, a widow can claim water rights, same as a veteran. Joint filing makes it stronger, especially if they're married. Married? First, Carolyn asked, though she'd expected as much. Oh, yes, the clerk nodded emphatically. Has to be proper and legal. No exceptions. They thanked him and stepped back into the sunlight, both quiet with their thoughts. The ride home seemed longer, the sun higher and hotter than before. As they passed through a grove of chokecherry trees, they came upon 3 Ute women gathering. The dark fruit in woven baskets. The eldest of the women recognized Carolyn and called out a greeting in her native tongue. Carolyn responded in kind, her pronunciation careful and respectful. After a brief exchange, the woman pressed a small basket of cherries into Caroline's hands. The gesture, speaking of friendship that went beyond words. Evening found them back at the ranch, the day's heat giving way to cooler air. Carolyn stirred a pot of rabbit stew, adding some of the chokecherries for sweetness. The kitchen filled with warmth and good smells as Jonah set 2 bowls on the rough-hewn table. They ate in thoughtful silence until Jonah set down his spoon. Been thinking on what the clerk said, he began, his voice steady, about marriage making the claim stronger. Carolyn looked up, waiting. If you'll have it, he continued, we can marry to keep the spring. His words were plain, honest as the man himself. Protect the water rights. Keep the judge and railroad from taking what isn't theirs. Carolyn set her own spoon down, studying him across the table. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years in the sun. She saw no deception there, no hidden motives, just a man offering what protection he could. She nodded once, decisive. For the land, she said quietly, and for the folks depending on it. The crickets sang outside, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Inside the kitchen, 2 people who had known loss sat across from each other, agreeing. To forge something new from necessity and respect? When? Carolyn asked practically. Town's got a preacher comes through every other Sunday, Jonah replied. That's 4 days from now. That'll do, she said, rising to clear the bowls. I'll need to alter my best dress, and we'll need witnesses. Jonah nodded, standing to help with the dishes. Old Bear and his wife might stand for us, and my foreman Jenkins. They worked together in a lamp-lit kitchen, the familiar routine of washing and drying somehow different now. Not more awkward, Carolyn thought. Just ... weighted with purpose. Like they were practicing for the years. Ahead, dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Jonah hitched the horses to his wagon. The morning air held a hint of fall, though summer still claimed the land. He worked methodically, checking each trace and buckle with care, while ranch hands moved about their morning chores with knowing glances. Inside the bunkhouse, Carolyn smoothed her hands over the blue cotton dress she'd altered by lamplight. The fabric, though plain, was good sturdy stuff, and the color brought out her eyes. She'd spent an hour pressing it with a heated iron, working out wrinkles that spoke of too many months folded away. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned up her hair, weaving in a ribbon that matched the dress. When she stepped outside, Jonah stood waiting by the wagon. He'd cleaned up proper, wearing a crisp white shirt and dark vest beneath his best coat. His hat, brushed free of trail dust, sat at a respectful angle. For a moment, neither spoke, each taking in the other's transformation from ranch wear to wedding clothes. You look fine, Jonah said, simply, offering his hand to help her up to the wagon seat. As do you, Carolyn replied, settling her skirts. Around her, the wagon wheels creaked familiar songs as they rolled toward Red Butte, the morning sun warming their shoulders. Fields of late summer grass stretched golden on either side, while ahead, the town's whitewashed church spire rose against blue mountains. Pastor Matthews, Jonah explained as they drove, served as chaplain in my cavalry unit. Good man, understands complicated situations. Carolyn nodded, appreciating that Jonah had chosen someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. The town came into view, already stirring with morning activity. Several people paused their work to watch the wagon pass. Word of the wedding having. Spread like wind through prairie grass, the church stood modest but welcoming, its white boards gleaming in the morning light. Pastor Matthews met them at the door, his weathered face creasing into a smile as he clasped Jonah's hand. Time had silvered his hair, but his eyes remained sharp and kind beneath bushy brows. "Brother Cade," he said warmly, then turned to Carolyn. "And this must be the lady. Welcome, welcome." Inside, sunshine streamed through plain glass windows, making patterns on the wooden floor. A few ranch hands had already arrived, cleaned up in their Sunday best. Old Bear and his wife stood near the front, dignified in their finest clothes, their presence a bridge between two worlds. Pastor Matthews led them to stand before the altar, its simple cross catching the morning light. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying to the back pews, "we gather today to join these two in holy matrimony." Matrimony. The familiar words of the ceremony filled the small church. When it came time for the vows, Jonah's deep voice remained steady, though Carolyn caught something in his eyes, a warmth that went beyond mere duty. Her own response came clear and true, despite the flutter in her chest. "With this ring," Jonah said, sliding a simple gold band onto her finger. The metal felt warm, weighted with promise. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Pastor Matthews declared, and the small congregation broke into subtle smiles and quiet congratulations. Outside, townsfolk had gathered with handshakes and good wishes. Mrs. Peterson from the mercantile pressed a fresh-baked apple pie into Caroline's hands, while Mr. Jenkins, Jonah's foreman, clapped him on the shoulder. With rough affection, Old Bear approached. Then last, his stance proud but gentle. He spoke first in Ute, then in English. "May your union bring strength to the land and its people." His wife offered Carolyn a small leather pouch containing dried herbs for tea, a traditional blessing. For new beginnings? The afternoon sun had begun its westward slide when they finally climbed back into the wagon. The pie sat carefully wrapped between them, its sweet scent mixing with late summer dust. Carolyn found herself aware of every small movement Jonah made, every slight adjustment of the reins, though they'd ridden together many times before as. Dusk gathered around them. The first stars began to appear, bright points of light in the deepening blue. Though their marriage was meant to be one of convenience, Carolyn felt a curious warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the summer evening. She noticed how Jonah's arm, steady on the reins, occasionally brushed against hers, and how neither of them moved away. The ranch buildings emerged from the gathering darkness, familiar shapes against the night sky. Jonah helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary. Together they stood in the yard, the stars spreading their silver light across the land that had brought them together. "Reckon we should have some of that pie," Jonah said, softly, breaking the spell of the moment. Shame to let Mrs. Peterson's baking go to waste. Carolyn smiled, grateful for his gentle way of easing them past the strangeness of their new situation. "I'll fetch plates," she said, heading toward the kitchen with the pie balanced carefully in her hands. Inside they shared slices of the still warm pie by lamplight, their wedding bands catching occasional glints of the flame. Though they both knew their marriage was meant to be a name only. Something deeper than words passed between them in the quiet of their first evening as husband and wife. The crickets sang their evening songs outside, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called out to the night. Neither Jonah nor Carolyn spoke of the unexpected tenderness growing between them, but both felt it, steady and warm as the lamplight that illuminated their shared table. Morning light spilled across the ranch yard as Carolyn stepped out of the bunkhouse, breathing in the crisp dawn air. The world felt different today, lighter somehow, despite the weight of the gold band on her finger, or perhaps because of it. She adjusted her worn work shirt, tucking it neatly into her skirt, as Jonah emerged from the barn, leading two saddled. "Horses. Thought we might ride out to your spring," he said, holding the reins of her bay mare. "Need to see what we're working with before filing that claim." Carolyn nodded, accepting both the reins and his steadying hand as she mounted. The familiar leather of her saddle creaked welcomingly beneath her, and she patted the mare's neck. "We should check the fencing, too. It was starting to sag in places last time I was there." They rode side by side through the morning, their horses' hooves raising small puffs of dust from the trail. The late summer sun climbed higher, warming their shoulders as they discussed their plans. Jonah's deep voice carried clearly as he outlined his thoughts for protecting the spring. "Figure we can fence it proper," he said, gesturing with one hand. "Keep the cattle from mucking up the source, but leave plenty of access downstream where they need it. Maybe put in some proper troughs, too." "That would help during the dry season," Carolyn agreed. "The Ute showed me how to channel the overflow, so it doesn't just sink into the ground. We could extend that system." Jonah turned to her, interest brightening his eyes. "You know about water management?" "Had to learn," she said simply. "My husband was gone so much with his freighting. Someone had to keep things running." She paused, then added more softly, "The Ute were kind teachers, patient with my mistakes." They crested a small rise, and Carolyn's ranch came into view below. The weathered building stood quiet in the morning light, the windmill turning slowly. In the breeze, the spring bubbled up near a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves dancing silver green against the sky dot as they approached the main gate. Jonah swung down from his horse to check the hinges. "This needs fixing," he said, pushing at the sagging wood. "Won't take but a minute." Carolyn watched as he set to work, his movements sure and methodical. He repositioned the gate, testing its weight against the post. "Just needs a proper ... His words cut off as the entire structure suddenly gave way, collapsing around him in a shower of dust and splinters. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then Carolyn burst out laughing at the sight of her new husband sprawled in the dirt, tangled in the remains of the gate. The sound of her laughter, bright and unexpected, startled them both. Jonah sat up, brushing dust from his shirt, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Reckon that's the first time I've heard you laugh," he said quietly. Caroline's cheeks warmed. "First time I've had cause to in a while," she admitted. They spent the rest of the morning checking the spring and surrounding land. Carolyn showed Jonah the subtle signs of water beneath the surface that the Ute had taught her to read certain plants. The way the ground felt underfoot, the gathering of birds. He listened intently, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than doubt. As the sun began its westward slide, they turned their horses toward home. The ride back was comfortable, filled with practical discussion of their plans for the spring and the joint claim they would file. Carolyn found herself relaxing into this new partnership, appreciating Jonah's straightforward manner and careful attention to detail back at the bunkhouse. Carolyn set about making supper while Jonah tended to the horses. The familiar motions of mixing cornbread batter soothed her, and soon the kitchen filled with the warm scent of baking. She brewed coffee strong and dark, just as she noticed Jonah preferred it. They ate at the small table, the cornbread still. Warm from the oven, their conversation easy and practical. Through the window, Carolyn watched the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. A peaceful end to a hopeful day. But as true darkness fell, Jonah suddenly stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Fire," he said tersely, pointing through the window. Carolyn rushed to look. In the distance, against the black of night, an ominous orange glow rose from the direction of her ranch. Her heart clenched tight in her chest. Without a word, Jonah strode toward the door, grabbing his gun belt. Carolyn was right behind him, her skirts gathered in one hand as they hurried to the barn. They saddled their horses with practiced speed. Every second marked by the growing glow on the horizon, the horses seemed to sense their urgency, dancing beneath them as they mounted. Jonah checked his rifle in its scabbard, then looked at Carolyn. "Ready?" She nodded grimly, and they set off at a gallop, hooves thundering against the packed earth. The night air whipped past them, carrying the faint smell of smoke. Caroline's thoughts raced faster than their horses. Who would set fire to her ranch? The judge? The railroad? Or was it simple bad luck? A stray spark? A careless traveler? The glow grew brighter as they rode, casting strange shadows across the familiar trail. Caroline's hands tightened on her reins, her wedding ring pressing into her finger, a reminder of all they had to lose if the spring was damaged. Beside her, Jonah rode tall in his saddle, his face set in determined lines as they raced toward. The threatening light, the peace of their new beginning, had lasted less than a day, broken by the orange glow that beckoned them forward through the darkness. Their horses' hooves beat out a desperate rhythm as they rode, each stride carrying them closer to whatever waited at Caroline's ranch. The orange glow grew brighter as they crested the final rise. Caroline's heart seized at the sight before them. Her ranch house was completely engulfed in flames, the fire reaching hungrily toward the dark sky. Tongues of red and yellow danced against the night, casting grotesque shadows across the yard. The cattle, Jonah shouted over the roar of the flames. He spurred his horse toward the corrals where the few remaining head were lowing in panic. Pressed against the far rails, Caroline dismounted quickly, her boots hitting the packed earth hard. The heat from the fire struck her face like a physical blow. Through the smoke and chaos, her eyes fixed on the house, her home. Inside were the last pieces of her old life, treasures she couldn't bear to lose. Jonah was already working the corral gate, coughing as thick smoke rolled over him. The cattle burst free, their eyes wide with fear as they thundered past. He called out between coughs, "Caroline, stay back, stay back." But she was already running toward the house, her skirts gathered high. The front door still stood, though flames licked its edges. She kicked it open, ducking low beneath the smoke that billowed out. The heat was suffocating, but she knew exactly what she needed to find. Her husband's branding iron hung on its peg by the door. She grabbed it, the metal hot against her palm. The family Bible lay on the small table where she'd left it, its leather cover already warming from the approaching flames. She snatched it up, clutching both items to her chest. A thunderous crack split the air as a burning beam crashed down. Behind her, Caroline stumbled forward, choking on the thick smoke. She heard Jonah shouting her name from somewhere outside. The spring. She had to check the spring. Stumbling away from the inferno that was once her home, Caroline ran toward the bubbling water source. Even in the flickering firelight, she could see something was wrong. The usually crystal clear water was clouded with a white film that spread across its surface. "Lie," she whispered in horror, recognizing the caustic substance that had been poured into her precious spring. The water that sustained life across these lands had been poisoned. A sharp cry of pain cut through the night. Caroline whirled to see Jonah staggering under a falling piece of timber that had broken loose from the barn. He managed to partially dodge it, but the heavy wood struck his shoulder inside, driving him to one knee. "Jonah." She ran to him, helping him struggle to his feet. His face was streaked with soot, and he held his side carefully. "We need to get those cattle moving," he ground out through clenched teeth. "They're scattered but not far. We can still gather them." Caroline nodded, forcing back tears. There was nothing left to save here. The house was fully engulfed now, and the spring. The spring would need time to clear itself of the poison dot they mounted their horses, though Jonah's movements were stiff. And pained, the cattle hadn't gone far, still visible in the firelight. Working together, they began driving the small herd toward Jonah's ranch. The frightened animals were eager to move away from the fire, but keeping them together was exhausting. Worked hours passed as they pushed the cattle through the dark. Jonah's breathing grew more labored as bruises from the falling timber deepened, but he didn't slow. Caroline's throat burned from smoke, and her eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. The items she'd saved, the branding iron and Bible, were secured to her saddle, the only pieces of her old life she had left. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached Jonah's ranch, the cattle stumbling with exhaustion into his pasture. The morning light revealed the full toll of the night. Their clothes were filthy with soot and ash, their faces streaked with smoke and sweat. Jonah's right side was deeply bruised, the injury obvious in the way he carefully dismounted Carolyn. Slid from her saddle, her legs trembling with fatigue. She walked slowly to the porch steps and sank down, still clutching the rescued Bible. The enormity of what had happened began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. Her home, her independence, the spring that had sustained her, all of it attacked in one cruel night. A single tear finally escaped, trailing down her cheek through the soot. She didn't bother to wipe it away. Jonah lowered himself carefully. Beside her, his presence solid and steady despite his obvious pain. For a long moment they sat in silence, watching the sun rise over the land that was now their only home. "They meant to break us," Jonah said finally, his voice rough from smoke, but filled with quiet determination. "But we're not broken. We'll fight back, Carolyn. Whatever it takes, we'll fight back." She turned to look at him, seeing the same resolve in his eyes that she felt growing in her heart. They had lost much this night, but they had gained something. Too, an unshakable determination to stand together against those who would destroy what they held dear. "Yes," she said softly, her fingers tightening around the Bible in her lap. "We'll fight back." The morning after the fire, Jonah could barely move. The falling timber had left deep bruises across his right side, and every breath brought a sharp stab of pain. Carolyn found him struggling to dress, his face pale with the effort. "That's quite enough," she said firmly, placing a steady hand on his uninjured shoulder. "You're going to bed." "Can't," Jonah protested, though his voice was tight with pain. "Got to check the herd, ride fence. The herd will keep, and I can ride fence." Caroline's tone left no room for argument. "You took that blow, protecting our interests. Now let me protect yours." She helped him back to bed, noting how he winced with each movement. The bruising had spread overnight, painting his side in ugly shades of purple and black. Carolyn knew from experience that such injuries needed rest to heal properly. That afternoon she gathered the ranch hands in the yard. The men shuffled their boots in the dust, uncertain about taking orders from a woman. But Carolyn stood straight-backed, her voice clear and confident as she assigned their tasks. "Tom, you'll ride the north fence line. Jack, take the south. Report any damage directly to me." She turned to the foreman, a weathered man named Peterson. "Would you ride with me? I need to learn this land properly if I'm to help manage it." Peterson touched his hat brim, respect dawning in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am. Much obliged to show you around." Over the next 2 days, Carolyn fell into a rhythm. She rose before dawn to cook breakfast for the hands, biscuits, beans, and strong coffee. The men's initial wariness faded as they saw her competence. She could spot a weak fence post at 50 paces and knew exactly how to doctor a horse's stone bruise. Between tasks, she tended to Jonah. His injuries kept him confined to bed. Though he chafed at the enforced rest, she brought him broth and cornbread, changing the cool claws on his bruises and reading aloud from her rescued Bible in the evenings. On the morning of the second day, Carolyn spotted a freight wagon approaching on the main trail. She rode out to meet it, recognizing the driver as a man who regularly traded with the Ute. She pressed a carefully written note into his hand, along with a silver coin. "Please deliver this to Old Bear," she said. "It's important." The driver nodded, tucking both note and coin into his vest pocket, heading that way anyhow, should see him by sundown. Old Bear arrived the next morning, just as Carolyn finished, serving breakfast to the hands. He dismounted gracefully, his face creased with concern. From his saddlebags he withdrew several rolled papers. Carolyn led him to the porch, where they could speak privately. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, offering him coffee in her best cup. The elder accepted the drink with a slight bow. "The spring is sacred to my people," he said in careful English. "We have watched over it for many generations." He spread the papers on the small table. They were maps, some yellowed with age, others newer. Each showed the spring's location, marked with careful symbols. Old Bear's finger traced lines showing tribal boundaries and water rights protected by treaty. These were signed by government men, he explained, pointing to official seals. The spring cannot be sold or moved. It belongs to the land itself. Carolyn studied the maps intently, hope rising in her chest. Here was proof, legal proof, that the judge's plans were not just cruel, but unlawful. When she told Old Bear of her plan to confront the judge, his dark eyes showed concern. He is a snake who speaks with two tongues, the elder warned. Be careful of his bite. Inside the house, Jonah was finally able to sit up in bed, though his side still pained him. When Carolyn told him of her intention to ride to town, his face darkened with worry. It's too dangerous, he protested. The judge won't listen to reason, and his men won't hesitate to hurt you. Carolyn stood by the window, sunlight streaming across her determined face. You bought my freedom at that auction, she reminded him quietly. But you didn't buy my silence. I won't cower while that man destroys everything we're trying to protect. She crossed to the bed, taking Jonah's hand. His palm was warm against hers, calloused from years of ranch work. The spring isn't just ours, she continued. It belongs to the land, to the Ute people, to every rancher who depends on that water to survive. Someone has to stand up to him. Jonah studied her face for a long moment. Finally, he squeezed her hand. You're right, he admitted, but promise me you'll be careful. We've lost enough already. Carolyn nodded, touched by the concern in his voice. I'll take Peterson with me, she assured him. And I'll have something the judge doesn't expect, proof that the law is on our side. She spent the rest of the morning preparing for the confrontation. She copied the most important details from Old Bear's maps onto fresh paper, creating a clear record of the spring's protected status. The elder helped her mark the relevant treaty sections, explaining their significance. By early afternoon, Carolyn was ready. She changed into her best dress, still plain, but clean and pressed. The maps and documents were carefully stored in her saddlebags. Along with her husband's Bible, its presence reminded her that she fought not just for water rights, but for justice itself. Peterson waited in the yard with their horses saddled. He had strapped on his gun belt without being asked, understanding the gravity of their mission. Old Bear stood on the porch, his face solemn as he raised a hand in blessing. Carolyn checked on Jonah one last time before leaving. He was propped up against the pillows, worry evident in his eyes, despite his attempted smile. I'll be back before dark, she promised. See that you are, he replied softly. And Carolyn? She paused at the door. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. Her heart warmed at his words as she stepped out into the afternoon sun. Mounting her horse, she squared her shoulders and nodded to Peterson. Together, they turned their horses toward town, toward the confrontation that could determine not just their future, but the future of the entire valley. The maps in her saddlebags felt like a shield, the truth they contained giving her courage. She was no longer just a widow fighting for survival. She was a woman defending her land, her community, and her right to stand tall in the face of injustice. The first rays of sunlight painted Red Butte's weathered buildings in shades of gold, and rose as Carolyn guided her horse down the empty main street. Each hoofbeat echoed against the wooden walkways, stirring small clouds of dust that danced in the early morning light. She had left Peterson at the livery stable, knowing this confrontation needed to be faced alone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as she tied her mount to the courthouse hitching rail. The leather saddlebags felt heavy with their burden of truth. The marriage license, land claim papers, and Old Bear's carefully preserved treaty. Maps. The courthouse stood silent and imposing, its white painted boards stark against the brightening sky. Carolyn straightened her skirts and touched the small silver cross at her throat, drawing strength from its familiar presence. The wooden steps creaked under her boots as she climbed to the entrance. Inside, the air hung still and musty. Light filtered through tall windows, catching dust motes that swirled in her wake as she walked the empty corridor. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, each step measured and deliberate. Judge Whitlock sat behind his massive oak desk, a coffee cup steaming beside him. His smirk widened as Carolyn entered, and he made no move to stand. Well, if it isn't. The widow Hale, he drawled, deliberately ignoring her married name. Or should I say, Mrs. Cade? Such a convenient arrangement you've made. Carolyn refused to let his mockery rattle her. With careful precision, she withdrew the documents from her saddlebags and laid them on his desk, one by one. First, Judge Whitlock, here's my marriage license to Jonah Cade. The paper made a soft whisper as she smoothed it flat. Next, our joint land claim, filed properly, under the homestead clause for widows and veterans. The judge's smirk never wavered. Impressive paperwork, madam, but ultimately worthless. The railroads already paid good money for those water rights. The deal is done. Is it? Caroline's voice remained level as she unrolled the final documents, Old Bear's maps, their corners weighted with small stones from the spring itself. These tree maps tell a different story. Before the judge could respond, the heavy courthouse doors swung open with a bang that echoed through the building. Reverend Matthews, Jonah's former cavalry chaplain, strode in. His black coat flapped behind him like wings, and the Bible in his hand seemed to glow in the morning light. Judge Whitlock, the chaplain's voice boomed through the room. I believe you need to read something aloud for all to hear. Curious townsfolk had begun filtering in behind the chaplain, drawn by the commotion. Carolyn recognized the general store owner, the blacksmith, several ranchers whose cattle depended on the spring water. This is a private meeting, the judge snapped, rising from his chair. Clear the room. Nothing about water rights is private business, Reverend Matthews declared. He stepped forward, his finger landing firmly on the treaty map. Read it, Judge. Read the terms that were signed and sealed by the territorial governor himself. The judge's face had grown red, but he could feel the weight of the townspeople's stares. With obvious reluctance, he began to read. The spring known to the Ute people as healing waters marked here on this map shall remain undisturbed and accessible to all peoples until such time as an independent survey can be conducted by ... His voice trailed off, the implications clear. Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. Carolyn stood straight and tall, her voice carrying clearly through the courthouse. No survey has been conducted, Judge Whitlock. You had no right to sell what was never yours to sell. The railroad won't stand for this interference, the judge blustered, but his confidence had cracked. The railroad, Carolyn replied calmly, will have to abide by the law, same as anyone else. Unless you'd prefer I telegraph the territorial governor about how you've been selling protected water rights. More townspeople pressed into the courthouse, their whispers growing louder. Carolyn could hear fragments of conversation, concerns about cattle, memories of past droughts. Anger at backroom deals that threatened their livelihoods. The judge's face had gone from red to pale. He shuffled the papers on his desk, avoiding the accusing stares of his neighbors. Perhaps, he said stiffly, we should delay any water rights transfers until proper survey can be arranged. And the spring will remain accessible to all in? The meantime, Carolyn pressed, as the treaty requires. The judge gave a jerky nod, knowing he was cornered. The gathered townsfolk broke into approving murmurs, several stepping forward to examine the maps themselves. Reverend Matthews placed a supportive hand on Caroline's shoulder. Well done, Mrs. Cade, he said quietly. You fought this battle with truth and dignity. Carolyn gathered her documents carefully, tucking them back into her saddlebags. The morning sun now streamed fully through the courthouse windows, illuminating the dust in the faces of her neighbors, faces that now showed respect rather than pity. She had ridden into town as a widow defending her claim. She would ride out as a woman who had upheld justice, not just for herself, but for an entire community. The spring would continue to flow freely, nurturing the land and its people as it had for generations. The truth, like water itself, had found its way to the surface. And like the spring, it would not be contained by one man's greed. The setting sun painted long shadows across Red Butte's main street as Carolyn watched the railroad men pack their surveying equipment into their wagons. Their faces were grim, lips pressed tight with disappointment as they climbed aboard. The clatter of wagon wheels and horse hooves echoed off the weathered buildings as they headed east. Back toward Denver, Reverend Matthews stood beside Carolyn. On the wooden sidewalk, his Bible tucked under one arm. "Those fellows won't be back until the federal inspectors have their say," he said, satisfaction warming his voice. "I'll send word to territorial office first thing tomorrow. They'll want to hear about this attempted land grab." Carolyn nodded, feeling the weight of the day's victory settle into her bones. "Much obliged for your help, Reverend. I reckon we couldn't have done it without your timing." "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Mrs. Cade." He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Would you like an escort back to the ranch? These roads can be lonely, thank you, but I know the way." Carolyn untied her horse from the hitching post. "Besides, someone needs to tell Jonah how things turned out." The Reverend helped her mount, then tipped his hat. "I'll ride out tomorrow with news about those inspectors. Give my regards to that stubborn husband of yours." The ride home was peaceful, with only the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of meadowlarks keeping her company. The late afternoon sun warmed her back, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of prairie grass. Her thoughts drifted to Jonah, wondering how he was managing with his injuries. As she approached the ranch, the familiar sight of smoke rising from the chimney brought a smile to her face. The bunkhouse door stood open to catch the evening breeze, and through it she could Jonah sitting in his chair. His hands moved steadily over a piece of worn leather tack, working oil into the creases. He looked up at the sound of her horse, a grin spreading across his face as he took in her appearance. Dust from the ride had settled on her dress, and wisps of hair had escaped her neat bun. "Well, look at you," he called out as she dismounted. "Every bit the ranch boss, ain't you? Riding in all covered in honest trail dust." Carolyn felt warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "Someone had to face down the judge, seeing as you were laid up with those ribs. Come tell me how it went." Jonah set aside his work, wincing slightly as he straightened in his chair. "Did that old scoundrel give you any trouble?" Carolyn hung her hat on a peg by the door and settled into the chair opposite him. The leather creaked softly as she sat. He tried, but the treaty map spoke louder than his bluster. Reverend Matthews made quite an entrance too. Had the judge reading those agreements right out loud in front of half the town. Jonah's laugh turned into a grunt of pain, but his eyes sparkled. Wish I could have seen that. Thomas always did have a flair for timing. The railroad men packed up and left, Carolyn continued, reaching for the coffee pot on the small table. Between them, she poured 2 cups, adding a splash of cream to Jonah's the way she'd learned he liked it. The Reverend sending word to the territorial office about proper inspectors. "You did good," Jonah said softly, accepting the coffee. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, and neither pulled away too quickly. "Real good." The sun was setting now, painting the room in amber light that made the rough-hewn walls glow. Carolyn lit the lamp on the table, its gentle flame adding warmth to the growing shadows. The familiar sense of leather, coffee, and the stew simmering on the cook stove filled the air. "Supper's almost ready," she said, rising to check the pot. "Think you can manage to eat at the table tonight?" "Reckon I can," Jonah replied, carefully pushing himself to his feet, especially with cooking that smells that good. They settled at the table, and Carolyn served up bowls of rich beef stew with the last of yesterday's cornbread. The quiet between them felt different now, easier, more comfortable. It was the quiet of people who had fought side by side and come out stronger. As they ate in the lamplight. Carolyn noticed how Jonah's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, how his hands were both strong and gentle as they broke the cornbread. She saw the respect in his gaze when he looked at her, free from any hint of pity or doubt. The victory over the judge had done more than secure their water rights. It had cemented something between them, a partnership built on trust, respect, and perhaps something deeper neither was ready to name. The late summer breeze carried the sound of hammering across the valley. Near the restored spring, a small cabin was taking shape, its fresh-cut pine logs gleaming golden in the morning light. Neighbors from miles around had come to help rebuild after the fire. Their wagons circled like a makeshift town around the construction site. Carolyn watched from beneath a cottonwood tree as Jonah directed the raising of the cabin's ridge beam. His injuries had healed enough for light work, and he moved with purpose, pointing out where support posts needed to go. She smiled, remembering how he'd insisted on being part of the rebuilding despite her protests about his ribs. Old Bear and several Ute families had arrived 3 days ago, bringing knowledge of how to divert part of the spring's flow to prevent future tampering. The women showed Carolyn how to weave willows into protective barriers, while the men helped shore up the spring's banks with carefully placed stones. "Water is life," Old Bear said simply, his weathered hands placing a final stone. "Good. Neighbors protect it together." The morning sun climbed higher as Carolyn stirred a pot of beans over the cook fire, adding chunks of salt pork and dried peppers. Several ranch wives worked alongside her, kneading dough for bread and peeling potatoes. The air filled with the comfortable chatter of women at work, punctuated by shouts and laughter from the men at the building site. "Your Jonah's got a good eye for construction," Martha Webb said, wiping flour from her hands. "That cabin's going up straight and true." Carolyn felt a warmth in her chest at the words, "Your Jonah," but kept her voice steady. "He's particular about doing things right the first time, and particular about watching you when you're not looking," Sarah Johnson added with a knowing smile. "Been doing it all morning." Before Carolyn could respond, a chorus of cheers rose from the cabin site. The ridge beam was securely in place, marking a crucial milestone in the construction. The men climbed down from their perches, ready for the midday meal. They ate in the shade of the cottonwoods, sharing food and stories. Carolyn found herself seated next to Jonah, their shoulders barely touching. He'd passed her a tin cup of coffee, his fingers lingering against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. "Reckon we'll have the roof on by week's end," he said quietly, just for her ears. "Then you can stop worrying about me sleeping in that drafty bunkhouse." "Who says I'm worried?" Carolyn teased, but her eyes softened as she looked at him. The past weeks had changed things between them, slowly and surely as the turning of seasons. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. By sunset, the cabin's walls were complete, and the roof beams waited ready for tomorrow's work. The neighbors packed their wagons and headed home, promising to return in the morning. The Ute families retreated to their camp near the spring, where cooking fires dotted the growing darkness like earthbound stars. Sunday dawned clear and warm. The congregation gathered in the meadow near the new cabin for services, followed by a community picnic. Reverend Matthews had ridden out to lead prayers and check on the building progress, his satisfaction evident in his broad smile. Carolyn spread a quilt on the grass, arranging dishes brought by the neighboring families. Children played tag between the blankets while their parents visited, sharing news and plans for the fall harvest. The scene felt right, like a piece of her world that had been missing was finally falling into place. She was pouring lemonade when she felt it that steady gaze she'd come to know so well. Looking up, she caught Jonah watching her from across the meadow. His expression held the same intensity she'd seen that day at the auction, but now there was something more. Something that made her heart skip and her cheeks flush warm. It was the same look he'd given her when she'd insisted on helping him break the new horses last week, or when she'd played his mother's hymns on the pump organ in the evenings. A look that spoke of admiration, respect, and growing affection. The afternoon light was fading when the last wagon pulled away. Carolyn stood on the cabin's newly finished porch, watching the dust settle on the trail. Behind her, Jonah's boots scraped on the rough-hewn boards. "Walk with me?" he asked softly. They followed the path to the spring, now flowing clear and strong through its protected channel. The evening air was cooling, carrying the scent of sage and late summer grass. In the distance, coyotes called to the rising moon. Jonah stopped at the spring's edge, his hand resting on a smooth boulder. "Been thinking," he said, his voice low and earnest. "About our arrangement." Caroline's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "What about it?" He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing above. When we made this bargain, it was for the land, for survival. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But these past weeks working beside you, seeing your strength in your heart, it's become more than that, at least for me. Jonah. Carolyn whispered, barely trusting her voice. I don't want this to stay just a marriage of convenience, he continued. You're not just someone I'm helping anymore. You're the woman I want to build a life with. His hand found hers in the growing darkness. If you'll have me, truly have me, not just in name. Carolyn looked up at him, seeing the hope and vulnerability in his face. She thought of that desperate day at the auction, how she'd offered him sons as a bargaining chip. Now, standing in the gentle evening, she realized her dream of a family hadn't changed, but her reasons had. I still want those sons I promised. You, she said softly, squeezing his hand. But not because of any bargain. Because you're the man I trust to raise them, right? To teach them about honor and kindness and protecting what matters. She took a deep breath. Because somewhere along the way I fell in love with you, Jonah Kane. A smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He pulled her close, one hand cradling her cheek. I love you too, Carolyn, he whispered, and when his lips met hers, it felt like coming home. They stood by the spring as the stars emerged, holding each other in the growing night. The sound of water flowing over stones mixed with the evening. Songs of crickets and the distant howl of coyotes. It was a moment of choosing, not forced by necessity or law, but born of love grown steady and true as the land beneath their feet. The first snowflakes of winter drifted down from a pearl-gray sky, dusting the brown grass with white. Near the restored spring, Jonah's cattle grazed contentedly, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The flowing water remained, steady and clear, protected now by the careful stonework and willow barriers that had become a symbol of community strength. Inside the snug cabin, Carolyn stood at the cooking stove, one hand resting on her growing belly as she stirred a pot of venison stew. The familiar tune of Amazing Grace hummed softly from her lips, mixing with the gentle crackle of the fire. The window panes had frosted around the edges, creating delicate patterns that reminded her of her mother's lace. The changes in her body brought daily joy and wonder. At 5 months along, the roundness of her middle was unmistakable, and she'd taken to wearing her dresses looser, the fabric draped carefully over her expanding waistline. Martha Webb had helped her let out the seams just last week, both women chattering excitedly about the spring baby to come. The cabin door opened with a rush of cold air, and Jonah stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of snow and leather. He removed his hat, shaking off the accumulated snowflakes before hanging it on its peg by the door. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold, but his eyes warmed at the sight of her. Smells like heaven in here, he said, crossing the room in 3 long strides. His arms wrapped around her from behind, one hand settling protectively over hers where it rested on her belly. How are my 2 favorite people today? Carolyn leaned back against his chest, savoring his solid presence. We're just fine. Your son or daughter's been dancing all afternoon. Is that so? Jonah's voice held a note of wonder that never failed to touch her heart. He'd taken to talking to her belly in the evenings, sharing his plans and dreams with their unborn child. The stew's almost ready, Carolyn said, turning in his embrace to brush a lingering snowflake from his eyebrow. Did you get all the cattle moved to the sheltered pasture? Jonah nodded, reluctantly releasing her to remove his heavy coat. Got them. Settled just as the snow started. That spring-fed grass will keep them strong through the winter. He hung his coat beside his hat and moved to warm his hands by the stove. Been thinking about the fencing for the north pasture. Carolyn ladled the steaming stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table. Tell me about it while we eat. They settled into their chairs, the lamp casting a warm glow over their evening meal. Outside, the snow fell more steadily now, but inside was all warmth and comfort. Carolyn had crocheted new curtains for the windows, and Jonah had crafted a fine oak table to replace their makeshift one. Little by little, They were making the cabin truly their own. Figure we can start the new fencing come spring, Jonah said, breaking off a piece of fresh bread. The meltwater from the hills will make the soil easier to work for post holes. Thinking of extending it all the way to the creek bend? Carolyn nodded, considering. That would give us room for at least 50 more head next season. She smiled, remembering how naturally they'd fallen into saying us and we when discussing ranch business. And speaking of next season, Jonah continued, his expression growing serious but tender, I've been drawing up plans to expand the cabin. Figure we'll need more room, what with the little one coming. Caroline's heart swelled. You've been planning that long? Been sketching it out for weeks, he admitted. Thought we could add 2 more rooms off the back. One for the baby, and one for when your sister visits with her little ones. He reached across the table to take her hand. Want to make sure there's plenty of room for our family to grow. Tears pricked at Caroline's eyes. Happy ones this time. So different from the desperate tears she'd shed that night the ranch house burned. I'd like that very much. They finished their meal as darkness settled fully outside. The lamp's glow reflected in the frosted windows, creating a cozy sphere of light that seemed to hold the winter at bay. Carolyn could hear the spring's steady music beneath the soft shushing of falling snow. Jonah helped her clear the dishes, then insisted she rest while he banked the fire for the night. She settled into the rocking chair he'd surprised her with. On their 3-month anniversary, working on a small blanket she was knitting for the baby. Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed, she said softly, watching him move about the cabin with familiar ease. This time last year, I was facing losing everything. Jonah crossed to her chair and knelt beside it, taking her hands. In his. And now? She smiled, squeezing his fingers. Now I have everything I never dared to hope for. A home that's truly ours. A husband I love with all my heart. She guided one of his hands to rest on her rounded belly. And this little one, growing stronger every day. As if in response, there was a definite flutter beneath their joined hands. Jonah's eyes widened with delight, as they did every time he felt the baby move. Strong, just like their mama, he said proudly. Carolyn laughed softly. And steady. Like their papa. Through the window they could see the snow continuing to fall, coating the world in pristine white. The lamplight caught the crystals as they drifted past, making them sparkle like tiny stars. Inside, the fire crackled low and comforting, and the spring's voice carried up from the valley, the same spring that had brought them together. Now, flowing sure and protected through their land, Jonah rose and pulled Carolyn gently to her feet, gathering her close. They stood together in the warm circle of lamplight, holding each other as the snow fell outside. All their trials, the auction, the judge's schemes, the burning of the ranch house, seemed distant now, like storms. Long past, they had built something stronger than any threat. A home founded on love, trust, and mutual respect. Their future stretched before them, bright with promise, secure in the knowledge that they faced it together. The sound of the spring echoed softly in the winter night, steady and eternal as their love dot. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.